The air at 20,000 feet is a thin, treacherous ghost. It doesn't nourish, it only teases the lungs while the cold slowly crystallizes the blood. For Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, the west face of Siula Grande wasn't just a climbing objective, it was an obsession. They were young, fit, and possessed by that particular brand of mountaineering arrogance that suggests death is something that happens to other people. By the third day, the summit was theirs. But in the Andes, the summit is only the halfway point, and often the easiest part. As they began their descent in a gathering storm, the mountain decided to remind them of their insignificance. The disaster didn't come with a roar, but with a sickening crack. Joe was leading a routine stretch of down climbing when he reached out for a hold that wasn't there. He fell. It wasn't a long fall, perhaps 20 feet, but the impact was transformative. As he hit the ice, his right knee shattered, the tibia driven up into the knee joint with a force that sent a white-hot flare of agony through his entire nervous system. In that moment, high on a vertical wilderness of ice and rock, Joe Simpson was a dead man. He knew the rules of the high mountains. A broken leg at this altitude is a death sentence, not just for the injured, but potentially for his partner as well. When Simon reached him, the silence between them was heavier than the storm. They both knew. Yet Simon chose to fight. He tied two 150-foot ropes together and began the agonizing process of lowering Joe down the mountain, 300 feet at a time. It was a rhythmic dance of suffering. Simon would lower Joe, Joe would scream as his shattered leg clipped the ice, and then Simon would climb down to join him and repeat the process. They worked into the night, blinded by spindrift and numbed by a cold that reached minus 40 degrees. They were winning. They were beating the odds. Until they reached the edge of the world. Joe felt himself sliding faster, then suddenly there was no more ice beneath his boots. He swung out into the void. He was hanging over a massive crevasse, suspended by a rope that stretched up into the darkness where Simon sat, anchored only by a seat carved into the snow. Joe tried to climb the rope, but his hands were frozen blocks of meat, and his leg was a useless anchor of pain. Above him, Simon felt the weight. For over an hour he held on, his hands turning black with frostbite, his strength evaporating. He didn't know Joe was hanging in space. He only knew that the rope was taut, the weight was unmoving, and he himself was being pulled slowly, inch by inch, off the mountain to his death. In the frozen darkness, Simon reached for his knife. The sound of the rope snapping was a dull thud that Joe felt more than he heard. For a fraction of a second, he was weightless, a solitary soul suspended in the Andean night. Then, gravity reclaimed him. He plummeted into the black maw of the crevasse, certain that this was the end. He didn't hit the bottom, not a solid one anyway. He slammed into a narrow ice bridge wedged deep within the chasm. The impact knocked the remaining breath from his lungs, and for a long time he lay in a heap, waiting for the darkness to take him. But the darkness was cold, and the cold was sharp. He was still alive. Above him, the opening of the crevasse was a thin, cruel ribbon of moonlight. He screamed for Simon, but his voice was swallowed by the ice walls. He was 80 feet down, buried in the heart of a glacier with a leg that felt like it was being gnawed by a wolf. Meanwhile, Simon was a broken man. Above the crevasse, huddled in a shallow snow hole, he believed he had murdered his best friend. He had cut the rope to save his own life, a decision that would haunt him for decades. When morning broke, he looked into the abyss, saw no sign of Joe, and assumed the fall had been fatal. Exhausted and frostbitten, Simon began the long, ghostly crawl back toward base camp. Inside the glacier, Joe faced a choice: die slowly in the cold or move. He couldn't climb up. The overhanging ice was impossible for a man with 2 good legs, let alone 1 shattered limb. He looked down. The crevasse descended into a deeper, pitch-black throat. "If I go down," Joe whispered to the ice, "I'm choosing how I die." With a courage born of absolute despair, Joe lowered himself further into the darkness. He hopped and crawled along a narrow ledge of ice deeper into the bowels of the mountain. Then he saw it, a beam of sunlight piercing through the bottom of the glacier like a needle. There was a secondary exit, a hole where the glacier had pulled away from the rock face. He crawled toward the light. Every inch was a masterpiece of agony. He had to drag his shattered leg behind him, the jagged bone grinding inside his skin. When he finally pushed himself through the hole and out onto the lower slope of the mountain, he wasn't greeted by rescue. He was greeted by a vast, boulder-strewn wasteland of moraine. He was still miles from camp. He had no food, no water, and his partner was gone. The next 3 days were a descent into madness. Joe was no longer a man. He was a creature of pure will. He couldn't walk, so he hopped. When hopping became too painful, he sat on his bottom and pushed himself forward with his arms, dragging his dead leg through the sharp rocks. Dehydration began to warp his mind. He started to hear voices, a third person walking beside him, encouraging him, mocking him. He became obsessed with a rhythmic song playing in his head, a song he hated, but it gave him a tempo to move to. Push, drag, breathe. Push, drag, breathe. By the second day on the moraine, his skin was burnt gray by the sun and his lips were cracked and bleeding. He was drinking melted snow that was mostly grit and dirt. He tracked his progress by landmarks, a red rock, a patch of yellow moss. If he could reach the next rock, he allowed himself to rest for 5 minutes. If he didn't, he forced himself to keep going. He was losing the battle. His mind was slipping away, drifting into golden hallucinations of warm beds and hot tea. But then, he smelled something. It wasn't the sterile scent of snow, it was the smell of wood smoke and human waste. Base camp. He arrived in the middle of the night, a skeletal figure covered in filth and frost. He was crawling through the dirt, his clothes shredded, his eyes sunken into his skull. He reached the tents just as Simon was preparing to leave the next morning. When Simon stepped out of his tent and saw the creature dragging itself through the dust, he didn't see a man. He saw a ghost. The silence at base camp was shattered not by a shout, but by a sound that Simon Yates would later describe as animalistic, a dry, raspy croak that barely resembled a human voice. Simon stood frozen by his tent, the morning sun casting long, deceptive shadows across the rocks. He had spent the last few days in a funeral fog, paralyzed by guilt and the crushing weight of the decision he'd made on the cliffside. He had already burned Joe's clothes. He had said his goodbyes to the mountain. But the figure in the dirt was real. Joe was barely recognizable. His face was a mask of black frostbite and yellowed skin, his eyes wide and bloodshot, glowing with a frantic, rhythmic madness. He had crawled through the laundry area, the place where they went to the bathroom, because he was too delirious to navigate around it. He was covered in filth, his hands raw to the bone. "Joe?" Simon whispered, his voice trembling. The creature in the dust stopped moving. A jagged, terrifying smile broke across Joe's cracked lips. "Simon," he wheezed. The rescue was not a moment of cinematic triumph. It was a desperate, messy struggle to keep a dying man alive. Simon and their friend Richard, who had stayed at the camp, hauled Joe into a tent. They stripped off his frozen rags, gasping at the sight of his leg. It wasn't just broken, it was a bloated, purple ruin, twisted at an impossible angle. For the next several days, they stayed in that tent, pinned down by the same storm that had tried to claim Joe. Simon tended to the man he thought he had killed, feeding him soup, spoonful by spoonful, watching as Joe drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. In those quiet hours, the air in the tent was thick with the unsaid. The psychological aftermath of Siula Grande was, in many ways, as grueling as the physical descent. Once they returned to civilization, the mountaineering community erupted in a firestorm of controversy. The news that Simon Yates had cut the rope traveled fast, and the judgment was swift. In the pubs of Chamonix and the climbing gyms of Sheffield, people called him a murderer. They whispered that he had broken the ultimate taboo of the mountains. But Joe Simpson did something unexpected. He didn't blame Simon. In fact, he became his fiercest defender. He did exactly what he had to do, Joe would tell anyone who would listen, his voice firm despite the crutches he would use for years. If he hadn't cut that rope, we'd both be dead. He gave me a chance, even if neither of us knew it at the time. Yet, for Joe, the mountain stayed with him. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the white spider of the crevasse. He felt the weightlessness of the fall and the crushing loneliness of the dark. He struggled with post-traumatic stress, the phantom pain in his leg acting as a constant reminder of the 3 days he spent crawling through the void. He underwent 6 major surgeries. Doctors told him he would never climb again, that he'd be lucky to walk without a heavy limp. But the man who crawled out of a glacier wasn't interested in lucky. He was interested in survival. Joe took to the typewriter as a form of therapy. He poured the agony of the Andes onto the page, writing, "Touching the Void." He didn't just write about the ice and the ropes. He wrote about the voice, that cold, detached part of the human psyche that takes over when hope is gone. He wrote about the song by Boney M that played on a loop in his head while he was dying, a bizarre detail that grounded the epic tragedy in the absurd reality of the human mind. Years later, Joe and Simon returned to the base of Siula Grande for the filming of the documentary. Standing in the shadow of the west face, the sun hitting the same jagged ridges that had nearly become their headstones, the two men looked up in silence. The mountain hadn't changed. It was still a cathedral of ice and indifference. It didn't care that Joe had survived, and it didn't care that Simon had suffered. Joe looked at his hands, now scarred and weather-beaten, and then at Simon. There were no grand speeches of forgiveness. There didn't need to be. The bond between them was forged in a way that people who stay at sea level could never understand. They were 2 parts of a single story, the man who cut the rope and the man who fell. The story of Joe Simpson isn't just a story about mountain climbing. It's a December story, a tale for the darkest, coldest part of the year. It reminds us that even when the light is a mere pinprick at the bottom of a frozen abyss, and even when we are crawling on our hands and knees through the dirt of our own despair, the human spirit has a terrifying, beautiful habit of refusing to let go. Joe Simpson didn't just survive a fall. He survived the silence. And as the winter wind howls outside the window today, his story remains a testament to the fact that as long as you can breathe, you can crawl. And as long as you can crawl, you are not yet lost.